At 2:53 in the morning, a passenger train called the Sunset Limited rolled through the Alabama darkness at full speed, carrying families, tourists, and people simply trying to get home. Most of them were asleep. The crew up front had no reason to expect danger. The track ahead looked normal, because in the black, foggy swamp there was nothing obvious to warn them. But 8 minutes earlier, a towboat pushing heavy barges had slammed into the bridge and quietly shoved the rails out of alignment. No alarm sounded, no signal turned red, no dispatcher was warned in time. The first sign that anything was wrong was going to be the moment the locomotive hit twisted steel at highway speed, and the entire train began to fall into the water. The Sunset Limited was Amtrak train number 2, a long-distance passenger run that crossed the southern United States. On paper, it was a routine trip. It had sleeping cars, coach cars, and the kind of quiet, late-night rhythm that settles into a train once the lights are low and the conversations fade. People change into comfortable clothes, stretch out, and trust the rails the way drivers trust a highway lane marker. You're moving fast, but you feel safe, because the path is fixed and the system is supposed to be controlled. On the night of September 21st into the early morning of September 22nd, 1993, the Sunset Limited left New Orleans late in the evening, headed east. That stretch of track would take it across Mississippi and Alabama toward Florida. There were no mountains here, no dramatic cliffs, just flat country, waterways, marsh, and long, dark miles where rail and river exist side by side. South of Mobile, Alabama, the environment changes into something that feels almost like another world at night. The water is not an open lake, and it is not a clean, straight canal. It is a maze. The Mobile River system and its surrounding bayous spread out into low, swampy land where channels split and rejoin. In daylight, you can at least read the horizon. At night, especially in fog, there is no horizon at all. Only a small circle of visibility, and beyond it, blackness. One of the channels in that area is called Big Bayou Canot. It is not the main commercial route. It is a narrow, quiet waterway in a marshy landscape, crossed by a railroad bridge that carries a single track. That bridge is the reason trains can keep a straighter path through the wetlands instead of detouring far away. It is also the kind of place most people never think about, because the bridge looks like a normal piece of infrastructure and the bayou below it looks like a normal strip of water. But that night, Big Bayou Canot was going to become the deadliest accident in Amtrak history. The reason it happened begins on the water, hours before the train reached the bridge. Just after midnight, a towboat named Malvila left the National Marine Fleet area on the Mobile River. It was pushing 6 barges arranged in a wide block, 2 rows deep and 3 barges across. Barges like these are not small. They move like floating freight platforms, heavy and stubborn. A towboat can steer them, but it cannot stop them quickly, and it cannot spin them on a dime. In good visibility, with the right charts, with a crew fully locked in, a tow like that can be handled safely. In poor visibility, in the wrong channel, it becomes a drifting battering ram. The Malvila was operating in dense fog. Fog on water is different from fog on land. On land, you still have signs, buildings, and edges of the road. On water, especially in a river system with multiple branches, fog erases the world. The pilot may be looking at a radar screen and trying to interpret what is ahead, but radar is only as good as the person reading it, and it does not automatically tell you are in the wrong place. It gives you shapes, returns, distances, and echoes. If you misread what those shapes represent, the radar becomes a false sense of security. As the Malvila moved northbound, the fog hid landmarks, and the maze of waterways offered opportunities to make a wrong turn that might not feel like a wrong turn until it is too late. The Mobile River is the main channel used by commercial traffic. Big Bayou Canot is not supposed to carry that kind of barge movement. But in the fog, the towboat ended up leaving the main route and entering the bayou. This was the first major link in the chain, not a dramatic failure, not a loud disaster, just a navigation mistake in darkness that placed a heavy tow in a channel where it did not belong. And the second major link was the bridge itself. The railroad bridge over Big Bayou Canot was not built like a modern highway bridge designed to take repeated impacts from marine traffic. It was a railroad structure carrying a single track, and it did its job as long as what passed under it remained what was expected, small boats or nothing at all. There was no system installed on the bridge to detect a strike and instantly warn the railroad. There was no automatic mechanism that would throw signals to red the moment the bridge was hit. In 1993, there were places in America where rail safety had advanced, and places where it still relied heavily on the assumption that the infrastructure would remain in position unless someone reported otherwise. On this night, nobody reported it in time because the people who caused the damage did not immediately understand the damage they had caused. At about 2:45 a.m., the Mauvilla's tow collided with the railroad bridge at Big Bayou Canot. When heavy barges hit a bridge, they do not tap it, they shove it. The force can move structural components that look solid and immovable because even steel has limits, and support structures can shift under sideways pressure. The impact did not just scrape paint, it displaced the bridge structure enough to move the track out of proper alignment. Rails are designed with tight tolerances. A train can handle gentle curves. It cannot handle a sudden sideways offset where the track no longer continues straight across the bridge the way the wheels expect. The deadly reality is that from far away, especially at night, the rails can still appear to be there. Nothing is missing. Nothing is obviously broken in a way a human eye can detect at speed. The track is simply not where it is supposed to be. This is what made the situation so frightening. The bridge was now a trap, and the trap looked normal. The Mobila's crew had their own crisis unfolding. In the fog and confusion, they struggled with control of the tow, and after the collision, they were dealing with the immediate problem of a tow that was no longer behaving the way it should. A towboat operator might call for help, might attempt to regain control, might focus on what is happening right around the vessel, because on the water, a drifting tow can cause secondary collisions or run aground. The attention becomes local and urgent. Meanwhile, on the railroad, the Sunset Limited was still coming. The train reached Mobile in the early morning hours. It arrived around 2:30 a.m. and departed a few minutes later, continuing east. The crew up front had no warning that anything had happened to the bridge ahead. Dispatchers had not stopped the train. Signals did not automatically protect the bridge from a strike. The track circuit system that detects the presence of trains is not designed to detect a bridge being shoved sideways by a barge. It can tell you a train is on the rails. It cannot tell you the rails have moved. At this point, the chain of events had locked into place. A towboat in dense fog had entered the wrong channel. 6 barges hit a bridge that was not protected by impact detection alarms. The structure shifted. The track became misaligned, and the passenger train, right on schedule for that stretch of the night, continued forward as if nothing had happened. This is the part of the story that makes the hair on your arms stand up because there is no villain twirling a mustache, no single moment where someone pulls a lever and causes the crash. Instead, there is a quiet, almost invisible transition from normal to doomed. In the sleeping cars, people were in bunks behind curtains. In coach, people had their heads against windows. Some passengers may have been awake, reading under a small light, listening to the soft rhythm of the train, trusting the consistency of the track. When you are a passenger, you do not think about bridge supports. You do not picture barges in the dark. You do not imagine a span of steel being shoved several feet sideways 8 minutes before you arrive. Up front, the locomotive engineer and crew were doing what crews do in the middle of the night: monitoring speed, following signals, running the train through territory that had been traveled countless times before. The authorized speed in that area was around 70 miles per hour, the kind of speed that makes distance disappear quickly. At that speed, you have seconds to react to a visible obstruction, and you have no chance at all to react. To track that looks normal until the wheels are already on it. The bridge at Big Bayou Canot was ahead now, hidden in fog, surrounded by swamp water. It was not a dramatic landmark. It was just another crossing in a long list of crossings. And as the Sunset Limited closed the final distance, the rails on the bridge waited in the wrong place, lined up for catastrophe, while the train continued forward into a darkness that offered no warning at all. The first wheel set hit the bridge at full speed, and in that instant, the logic of steel on steel collapsed. The rails were no longer where the train expected them to be. Instead of guiding the locomotive straight across the bridge, the shifted track forced the wheels sideways, and the physics of a 70-mile-per-hour passenger train took over. There was no long screech of braking, no gradual loss of control. The locomotive left the rails almost immediately, and once the lead engine derailed, everything behind it was doomed to follow. The front locomotive lurched violently to the left. The engineer had only a fraction of a second to understand that something was wrong before the engine was no longer riding on the track. The bridge offered no forgiveness. The locomotive plowed into the structure, tore through guardrails that were never designed to stop something that heavy, and plunged off the bridge into big bayou canot below. Behind it, the second locomotive followed the same path. Dragged by momentum and the rigid coupling that links train cars together, the engines hit the water nose first, slamming into the dark bayou with enormous force. Fuel tanks ruptured on impact. Diesel fuel spilled across the surface of the water, forming a slick that spread quickly in the confined channel. The first passenger cars never had a chance. As the locomotives fell, the cars behind them jackknifed. Some twisted sideways and slammed into the bridge structure. Others were pulled forward and down, ripped from the track, and thrown into the water. The train did not simply derail. It disintegrated. Inside the cars, passengers were thrown from their seats and bunks without warning. The transition from steady motion to chaos happened faster than the brain could process. People were asleep one moment and airborne the next. Luggage came loose from racks. Glass shattered. Metal screamed as cars tore apart. The sleeping cars were among the most deadly places to be. Curtains, blankets, and personal belongings became entanglements as water rushed in. When rail cars enter water at speed, they do not float gently. They slam, tilt, and begin to fill almost immediately. Windows break, doors jam. The interior turns dark as power fails. Passengers who survived the initial impact described being thrown against walls and ceilings, then suddenly being submerged. There was no gradual flooding. Water surged in violently, cold and disorienting, carrying debris and fuel. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell which way was up without feeling for air. Some cars remained partially on the bridge. Others were suspended at angles, twisted and unstable, one end supported by steel and the other hanging over open water. People inside these cars faced a different terror, not drowning immediately, but knowing that the car could shift or collapse at any moment. The coach cars were packed with people who had no warning and no time to brace. Survivors later described the sound as explosive, even though there was no actual explosion. The noise came from metal tearing, glass shattering, and the impact of tons of machinery slamming into water and structure all at once. Crew members were injured or killed in the chaos. The engineer in the lead locomotive did not survive. The conductor and other crew members who were positioned farther back had little ability to coordinate an organized response in the first moments because communication systems were damaged and the physical separation of cars made movement dangerous. Within minutes, the scene became one of confusion and survival rather than rescue. People who could move began helping others without knowing the scale of what had happened. Some crawled through broken windows. Some climbed through twisted doors. Others were forced to swim blindly through submerged sections of rail car to find an exit. Big Bayou Canot was not open water. It was a narrow, muddy channel surrounded by swamp. The bottom was soft, uneven, and littered with debris. The water was contaminated with diesel fuel, which burned eyes and lungs and made breathing more difficult for anyone who surfaced beneath the slick. Survivors described the taste and smell as overwhelming, adding panic to already desperate conditions. Emergency lighting was gone. There were no floodlights illuminating the wreck. The only light came from flashlights, small personal devices, and later from rescue vehicles arriving on distant access roads. Until then, the darkness was nearly total. The first emergency calls came in from survivors and from the tugboat crew, who now realized the gravity of what had occurred. But reaching the site was not simple. There was no nearby highway exit that led directly to the bridge. Responders had to navigate dirt roads, marsh paths, and limited access points. Boats were needed, but boats also had to find their way through the same confusing waterways that had caused the original navigation error. Local law enforcement, fire departments, and emergency medical teams arrived to a scene unlike anything most of them had ever encountered. This was not a highway crash where vehicles could be accessed easily. This was a train wreck in a swamp, in the dark, with cars partially submerged, fuel on the water, and people trapped inside metal structures that could shift or sink without warning. Rescuers worked in unstable conditions. They climbed onto wrecked rail cars that were tilted and cracked. They entered water without knowing what hazards lay beneath the surface. They cut through metal where possible, using tools that were not always designed for rail equipment. Time mattered because for anyone trapped underwater, survival depended on how quickly they could be reached. Some passengers survived only because others refused to leave them behind. There were reports of people returning to partially submerged cars to help strangers escape, risking their own lives in the process. In disasters like this, formal roles disappear quickly. There are no passengers and no crew, only people who can move and people who cannot. As dawn approached, the scale of the wreck became clearer. Multiple cars were in the water. The locomotives were submerged. The bridge itself was damaged and littered with debris. Bodies were recovered from the bayou and from crushed cars. Survivors were treated for broken bones, head injuries, hypothermia, and chemical exposure from fuel. By daylight, it was obvious that this was not a survivable crash for everyone involved. The force of the derailment and the immediate immersion of several cars meant that many passengers never had a chance to escape. The official death toll would eventually be confirmed at 47 people, making it the deadliest accident in Amtrak's history. Yet even as rescue operations continued, another process had already begun quietly in the background. Investigators were arriving, measurements were being taken, photos were being documented. The focus was shifting from saving lives to understanding how a passenger train could be allowed to enter a bridge that had already been struck and displaced without a single warning stopping it. The wreckage sat in the bayou as a grim marker of everything that had gone wrong. The twisted steel, the submerged engines, and the shattered cars told a story that went far beyond a single mistake. It pointed toward gaps in communication, gaps in monitoring, and a system that assumed someone else would notice a problem before it became fatal. As bodies were recovered and survivors were transported away from the swamp, the question that hung over Big Bayou Kanat was no longer just how many had died. It was how an entire chain of failures had lined up so perfectly that a train full of sleeping passengers could be sent unknowingly straight into disaster. When the last survivors were removed from the wreckage and the final bodies were recovered from Big Bayou Kanat, the disaster entered a quieter and more unsettling phase. The chaos of rescue gave way to paperwork, measurements, diagrams, and sworn testimony. This was the point where emotion had to be set aside and the system itself was put on trial. The question investigators faced was not simply what happened, but why nothing stopped it. The confirmed death toll stood at 47, dozens more were injured, some severely, and many carried long-term physical and psychological scars. Families were notified in the early morning hours and throughout the day as authorities worked to identify victims. For them, the crash was not an abstract failure of infrastructure. It was a permanent dividing line between before and after. The National Transportation Safety Board took the lead in the investigation. From the beginning, the physical evidence made one fact unavoidable. The train did not cause the derailment by speeding or by operator error. The rails on the bridge were not in proper alignment when the Sunset Limited arrived. The train was routed unknowingly onto a compromised structure. Investigators reconstructed the timeline minute by minute. The towboat Mauvila struck the bridge at approximately 2:45 a.m. The Sunset Limited reached the bridge around 2:53 a.m. That 8-minute window was the only opportunity for intervention. No one closed it. The bridge had no system to detect an impact and automatically notify railroad dispatchers. There were no sensors that could register a structural shift and change signals to red. The railroad signal system was functioning as designed because it was designed to detect trains, not damaged infrastructure. From the system's perspective, the track was clear. This revealed one of the most critical vulnerabilities in rail safety at the time. Railroads and maritime operators functioned in overlapping physical spaces, but under largely separate oversight. A barge could strike a rail bridge without triggering any automatic communication between the marine world and the rail world. The system depended on human reporting, and in this case, human reporting did not happen in time. The NTSB found that the Mauvilla had entered Big Bayou Kanat unintentionally. Navigation errors were made in dense fog, compounded by misinterpretation of radar information and inadequate chart usage. The tugboat crew believed they were still in the main Mobile River channel. they were not. By the time they realized something was wrong, the bridge had already been struck. The investigation also examined why the bridge was vulnerable to such an impact. The structure was not protected by fendering systems designed to absorb or deflect barge collisions. Fender systems were common on bridges over heavily trafficked waterways, but Big Bayou was not classified as such a route. That classification, however, did not prevent a tow from entering it in poor conditions. The result was a bridge that could be moved by a lateral force it was never expected to encounter, combined with a rail system that had no way of knowing it had been moved. Responsibility did not rest on a single individual. The NTSB's findings pointed to a layered failure. Marine navigation procedures failed, bridge protection standards were insufficient, rail monitoring systems were incomplete, communication protocols between agencies were inadequate. Each layer alone might not have caused a catastrophe. Together, they made one inevitable. Legal consequences followed, but they unfolded slowly and quietly, far from the public eye. Lawsuits were filed on behalf of victims and families. Settlements were reached. Liability was apportioned among parties connected to the towboat operation and other entities involved. There was no dramatic courtroom moment that captured national attention. There rarely is in infrastructure disasters once the cameras leave. Changes did come, but they were incremental rather than revolutionary. Greater attention was given to protecting rail bridges over navigable waterways. Improved communication procedures between marine operators and rail authorities were emphasized. The disaster became a case study used by safety professionals rather than a story retold to the public. And that leads to one of the most haunting aspects of the Sunset Limited crash. Despite being the deadliest accident in Amtrak's history, it faded quickly from national memory. There was no massive fireball visible from miles away. There was no dramatic video footage broadcast live. The crash happened in a swamp at night far from major population centers. The victims were dispersed across many states, not concentrated in a single community that would demand remembrance year after year. The story did not fit the pattern of disasters that become cultural reference points. Yet the implications of what happened at Big Bayou were profound. It exposed how modern transportation systems can fail not because of reckless behavior, but because of assumptions. Assumptions that a bridge will not be struck, assumptions that someone will report damage in time, assumptions that separate systems will somehow protect each other without being connected. For the passengers who boarded the Sunset Limited that night, the journey felt ordinary. That is what makes the tragedy so unsettling. There was no warning to ignore, no obvious danger sign, no chance to choose differently. The system that was supposed to protect them never realized it needed to. Today, Big Bayou looks quiet again. Water flows under the rebuilt bridge. Trains pass without incident. To an unknowing observer, there is nothing to suggest that this stretch of track once became a killing ground because of 8 unbroken minutes of silence. The legacy of the Sunset Limited crash is not just the number 47. It is the reminder that in complex systems, disaster does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the dark, between 2 routine movements, and by the time anyone realizes what has happened, there is nothing left to stop it. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.